Hello everyone, this is MA Fish Gardens. I wanted to do a video that talked about the nitrogen cycle and why it's so important, and a fundamental concept that really people should have at least a basic understanding of. The nitrogen cycle is a concept or this cycle of processing waste products in your tank. Understanding this will help you to be able to understand tank maintenance, why is it so important, the tank keeping, help troubleshooting any problems that arise in the tank, and also to try and head off any problems that you may have in the future. Now, the nitrogen cycle isn't the end-all be-all. It's not the only thing in fish keeping and tank keeping that you need to understand, but it is one important piece of it that will help to make you more successful in keeping tanks and being able to keep fish happy and healthy. So, the nitrogen cycle is all about waste processing and how is waste in your aquarium being processed into less toxic substances. Now, you may hear people talk about cycling their tank. They're going through cycling, they've cycled their tank. What does that mean? Basically, a cycle tank is a tank that has gone through a process basically where they have grown bacteria in their tank and have reached a state of equilibrium and a balance between the waste and beneficial bacteria. When you are going through the cycling process, you're growing bacteria in all the surfaces on your tank. So this is why you may hear people talking about increasing their surface area or wanting more surface area. Things like ceramic logs, rings, live rock have lots of nooks and crannies which bacteria can grow in. The more bacteria you have, the more capacity you have to be able to process waste products, or the more fish you could potentially have in a system. Now, remember, this is a cycle, so it's an equilibrium between the amount of waste, fish, plants, bacteria, algae, etc. And if there are changes to any of those different things, the amount of fish, the amount of waste, the amount of plants, the amount of bacteria, this is when you can develop problems or no longer have an equilibrium. So you may hear people say something like they lost their cycle, their tank crashed. So anytime you make changes to your tank, you have to be careful that you may no longer have your tank cycled. If you suddenly increase a bunch of fish, you suddenly changed how you're feeding. If you do excessive cleaning and you end up remove a bunch of bacteria, or let's say you medicate your tank and you kill off the bacteria, you then no longer have an equilibrium. So if you do not have a cycled tank, you're more likely to have issues with waste products rising to toxic levels and affecting the health and lives of your fish. This is why it's important to understand about the nitrogen cycle and why you may want to have your tank cycled, or at least start the process of cycling it before you buy your fish or even put your fish in the tank. So now let's talk about the nitrogen cycle. Where there's fish, plants, or food, there's decaying matter or waste. And the result of waste is ammonia. Ammonia is a very toxic substance, and even in low amounts can hurt or even kill your fish, particularly if you have more sensitive fish. Like behind me, I have a Mabu puffer, very sensitive to any type of water changes. Even not super sensitive fish, you can see problems very quickly as your ammonia level starts to rise. Even in small amounts, and then with increasing amounts, the more likelihood and the faster you will start to see the health of your fish being affected. You can start to see burns on the fish if it becomes high. Now, in order to remove ammonia from your tank, you have to have bacteria that is able to convert it. You remove it from your water through water changes, or rather dilution, or you have plants that may remove it. Now, there are some plants that are able to process or consume ammonia, and there seems to be some debate on how much it's actually able to absorb and is it substantial enough. Now, for the sake of this video, we're not going to talk about that because I just want to focus on the cycle. So as you cycle your tank, you start to grow nitrifying bacteria. This is the beneficial bacteria. This will process ammonia into a somewhat less toxic substance called nitrites. Now, it does take time for the bacteria to grow, so you have to have patience. Now, there are different ways that you can cycle a tank. We'll talk about that in a separate video, but it's going to take time. Once you have nitrifying bacteria growing nitrites, continuing on in the cycle, you start to grow more and slightly different bacteria that will then process the nitrites into nitrates. Nitrates are a much less toxic substance and much safer for your fish than ammonia or nitrites. It can be harmful, but at much higher levels than what you would see for ammonia and the nitrites. Now, I had the hardest time remembering which one was safe, which one do you not want in your tank. So I came up with this silly saying, A is okay. Nitrates are okay. So I know it's silly, but if it helps you to remember, I'll look a little silly. Now, to remove the nitrates from your tank, you are removing it through your water changes, or if you have plants, your plants are consuming the nitrates. Now, looking at the cycle, things to look at for determining if you're cycled. In not a super heavily planted tank, you would do your water testing. And if you have no ammonia, no nitrites, but you have nitrates, you are cycled. Your tank and the bacteria in the tank is processing the waste product effectively into the nitrates, which is that less toxic substance. I want to touch on the point about planted tanks and nitrates and seeing where you are in your cycle, because there seems to be some misinformation out there, people maybe not quite understanding. When you have a heavily planted tank, and not a heavy bioload, or you've just completely stocked your tank with plants, you may not see nitrates on your testing. Now, generally at first when you're starting, that's generally not what you do. You don't have a ton of plants, if you even have plants, so you would see nitrates. But sometimes if you only have a couple fish in there and a ton of plants, you may not see nitrates on your testing. That's because the plants are consuming the nitrates faster or just as fast as it's being produced. So when you do your testing, it will not show up. For example, I have a 3-gallon fish bowl that has a couple minnows, a couple ghost shrimp, and a couple snails with a good bit of guppy grass and some Amazon swords, and I don't show any nitrates on my testing. Now, if I were to go a long time without any water changes, or I do a really heavy feed, or like when I took out some of the guppy grass, I then started to see my nitrates. I have a fully cycled tank that has been running for a year. The fish are happy, healthy, and the plants are growing. Now, like I said, when I took out some of the guppy grass, I did see a little bit of the nitrates. Well, then as the plants start to grow again, I decrease on the feedings, then I no longer show those nitrates. So briefly, we'll talk about the testing and testing kits. So you're generally, in order to determine or look at your nitrogen cycle, you need to look at ammonia, nitrites, and nitrates, like we just talked about. There are other testing you can do, like GH, KH, phosphate, total dissolved solids, or even how you obtain the testing with strips or liquid testing. But that's not so much related to the cycling of the tank, so we're not going to get into that video, get into that for the sake of this video, but I will do a separate video that will do a deep dive into that. Basic testing kits will have pH, ammonia, nitrites, nitrates. You can buy individual test kits if you want. Generally, to start, I would recommend something that would give you all the information, and you can always add something later on if you wanted to, or like with the liquid test kit, if you run out of the ammonia faster, you can replace that without buying a full kit. No matter what method you use, they will have instructions on how to do the testing and give you a chart for the different values of each one of those tests, like for the ammonia, the nitrites, nitrates. So here is my test kit and the chart for reference for it showing the values of each one of the different things in the test kit. Now I have freshwater and a saltwater kit because I keep both freshwater and brackish water tanks. So just make sure you use the right kit for the setup that you have. Now you'll see the reference chart for the pH, the ammonia, the nitrite, and then the nitrates. So in summary, when you are cycling your tank, you will first start to see ammonia. Give it a little bit time, then you start to have nitrites, then you have nitrates. You know you have a fully cycled tank when on your testing you do not see any ammonia or nitrites. You only have nitrates, with the caveat if you have a heavily planted tank, but that generally comes later. Now, one thing to kind of think of, or sometimes can happen, is when you are testing with your nitrites, you may completely miss when they show up and your tank immediately starts converting to nitrates, especially if you're not testing every day. So you'll see you have you start with ammonia and then you go to nitrates. That's perfectly okay. Your tank is now cycled. So you can see where things can kind of get messed up in the cycle. If you add more fish at one time, you too much food at one time, you remove too much bacteria, you kill bacteria with medication. Basically, if there is more waste production than what the bacterial load in your tank can handle, it can lead to problems. And knowing what goes into the nitrogen cycle and what might affect it helps to make fish keeping a little bit easier and be able to help anticipate problems or even head off problems. Thank you for joining in on my video about the nitrogen cycle. Hopefully this helps to give you a little bit of understanding or maybe even provide a little bit of clarity on the nitrogen cycle. Now this is just one important piece of aquarium keeping, fish keeping that will help you to be a better fish keeper and help your fish and tanks be healthy and happy. Be on the lookout for future videos about how to cycle a tank and the different methods that you can use, troubleshooting abnormal parameters, and tank filtration. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like and subscribe button and let me know if there's anything that you would like to see or learn about next, and I'll see you on the next video.